On a remote farm in the Brazilian countryside, the silence of the night is broken by terrifying animal screams. A skeptical and rational farmer faces a legendary creature that defies his understanding of the world. As the horror unfolds, he fights not only to survive, but to keep his sanity intact. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of blood that spread over the lush fields of Santa Cruz Farm. Michael watched the landscape from his porch, feeling the weight of generations on his shoulders. The property, inherited from his ancestors, had always been a haven of peace and prosperity. Little did he know that that night, the tranquility of his existence would be shattered by claws that should not exist in this world. Twilight gave way to a moonless night, wrapping the farm in an almost palpable shroud of darkness. The silence was broken only by the occasional moo of a cow or the distant bark of a dog. Michael was preparing for another routine night, ignoring the unease that was starting to settle in his chest. Then the first scream cut through the air, a sound so sharp and laden with terror that it made Michael's blood freeze in his veins. It wasn't human, of that he was sure. It was the agonizing scream of an animal facing something beyond its understanding. Armed only with an old shotgun and a flashlight, Michael went out to investigate. The trembling beam of light revealed shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, and then he saw it. Footprints that did not belong to any animal he knew, deep and menacing, leading to the heart of his lands. That night, Michael would face a creature from the worst folkloric nightmares, an entity that defied logic and reason, leaving behind only traces of blood and the certainty that there are horrors in this world that the human mind is not prepared to comprehend. This is the story of the night the Chupacabra visited my farm and how I survived to tell what I saw. Believe it if you will, but know that there are truths hidden in the shadows of our lands, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Michael advanced through the property, his hesitant steps breaking dry twigs underfoot. The beam of his flashlight danced erratically, revealing shadows that seemed to writhe at the edges of his vision. The air was heavy, laden with a metallic odor that made his stomach churn. The animals, normally calm at this hour, were in an inexplicable frenzy. The cows mooed incessantly, a chorus of fear that echoed through the night. The horses in the stable neighed and kicked as if trying to escape an invisible predator. As he approached the corral, Michael noticed something strange on the ground. Kneeling, he ran his trembling fingers over the damp earth. Footprints, but they were not from any animal he knew in his 40 years of life in the countryside. They were deep, with sharp claw marks that seemed to have been driven into the soil with immense force. A shiver ran down his spine when he noticed the direction of the footprints. They led towards the heart of his property, where the main barn, housing most of his animals, was located. The wind suddenly changed, bringing with it a nauseating stench of rotten meat and something else, something Michael couldn't identify, but that made every hair on his body stand on end. It was an alien smell, completely out of place in that familiar environment. Then he heard it, a low sound, almost inaudible at first, but gradually growing. It was a growl, but unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't from a dog, nor a jaguar, nor any other known predator. It was a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell, a mix of fury and hunger that made Michael's blood run cold. His eyes scanned the horizon, desperately seeking the source of that terrifying sound. For a moment, he swore he saw 2 red dots glowing in the darkness like demonic eyes watching him. But when he blinked, the vision was gone. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. The reality he knew was unraveling around him, giving way to a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Something was lurking on his farm, something that shouldn't exist, and it was getting closer. Michael's heart pounded against his ribs as he approached the main barn. The silence that now reigned was more terrifying than the previous screams. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch. With a foreboding creak, the door opened, and the stench of death hit him like a punch to the gut. Michael staggered, fighting the urge to vomit rising in his throat. The beam of his flashlight revealed a scene straight out of his worst nightmares. The barn floor was covered by a slippery layer of blood, so thick it reflected the flickering light like a crimson mirror. Mutilated carcasses of sheep and calves were scattered around, their skins torn as if made of paper. But the most disturbing part was the surgical precision with which they had been gutted. There were no organs or flesh, just empty husks of what were once living animals. Michael stifled a scream upon noticing deep claw marks on the wooden walls, some so high that no known animal could have reached them. The metallic smell of blood mingled with an alien stench, a putrid fragrance that seemed to permeate every molecule of the air. In one corner he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of his dairy cows, still alive, was cornered, her eyes wide with terror, fixated on a point behind Michael. A guttural sound, a mix of gurgling and growling, made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Slowly Michael turned around. There, less than 10 feet away, stood a creature that defied logic. Its body, covered in greenish scales, was an aberration between reptile and mammal. The head, similar to a deformed dog, sported a row of razor-sharp teeth, but it was the eyes that paralyzed Michael, 2 red orbs glowing with malevolent intelligence and insatiable hunger. The Chupacabra, for Michael knew it could only be the legendary creature, stepped forward, its claws clicking on the bloody floor. Its long, forked tongue licked its lips in an almost human gesture of anticipation. Michael felt the weight of the shotgun in his hands, knowing it was his only chance of survival. But as he stared into those demonic eyes, a terrible certainty settled in his core. This night was far from over, and the true horror was just beginning. Time seemed to freeze as Michael stared into the demonic eyes of the Chupacabra. His finger trembled on the shotgun's trigger, the only barrier between him and certain death. The air, heavy with the scent of blood and fear, grew thick, with a roar that shook the barn's walls. The creature lunged. Michael fired, the deafening blast echoing into the night. The Chupacabra staggered, hit in the shoulder, but did not fall. Black, viscous blood oozed from the wound, sizzling as it touched the ground like acid. Michael backed away, his hands trembling as he tried to reload. The creature, recovering from the initial shock, leaped with supernatural agility. Sharp claws slashed through the air, inches from Michael's face. He threw himself to the side, feeling the displaced air from the attack. Rolling on the bloody floor, Michael fired again. This time the shot grazed the beast's head. A howl of pain and fury filled the air, so loud that Michael felt his eardrums would burst. Taking advantage of the momentary distraction, he ran out of the barn. The moon, previously hidden, now bathed the fields in a ghostly light. Michael ran like never before, his lungs burning, the muscles in his legs screaming in protest. Behind him, the sound of claws against the earth indicated the chase had begun. The Chupacabra moved with impossible speed, jumping over fences and ditches as if they were nothing. Michael reached a clearing, turning to face his pursuer. The creature stopped a few meters away, its red eyes glowing with insatiable hunger. For the first time, Michael saw the Chupacabra, completely in the moonlight. It was a natural aberration. Its muscular body was covered with a mix of thick hair and scales. The powerful hind legs, like those of a kangaroo, ended in claws capable of tearing through steel. The mouth, open in a snarl, revealed rows of razor-sharp teeth. Michael raised the shotgun, knowing it was his last chance. The Chupacabra crouched, preparing for the final pounce. At that moment, man and beast locked eyes, 2 predators trapped in a deadly dance. With a cry of defiance, Michael pulled the trigger just as the Chupacabra leapt. The shot echoed through the night, followed by a howl of supernatural agony. Man and beast collided, rolling on the ground in a tangle of limbs and claws. Michael felt a searing pain in his shoulder as he struggled to break free. The creature's weight was crushing, its fetid breath suffocating. With one last desperate effort, he managed to push the Chupacabra away. Staggering backward, Michael saw the creature writhe on the ground. The shot had hit it squarely, but it still wasn't enough to bring the beast down. The Chupacabra rose, black blood pouring from its wounded chest, its eyes now burning with murderous fury. Michael, injured and exhausted, knew he couldn't win this fight. His only chance was to run, to find shelter. With one last glance at the creature that defied all logic and reason, he turned and ran towards the main house, praying that his legs would hold and that the walls of his home would be strong enough to keep the horror outside. The night, however, was still young, and the true test of survival was only beginning. The barn emerged ahead of Michael like a beacon of hope in the darkness. His lungs burned, and his shoulder throbbed where the Chupacabra's claws had torn his flesh. With a final desperate effort, he threw himself against the heavy wooden door, closing it behind him with a dull thud. The interior of the barn was bathed in shadows, punctuated only by beams of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the boards. The smell of hay and animals, normally comforting, now only accentuated the terror of the situation. Michael knew he was trapped in a cage of his own making. With trembling hands, he began to push hay bales against the door, creating an improvised barricade. Every sound made his heart leap, imagining the creature ready to burst in at any moment. A sepulchral silence fell over the barn. Michael, leaning against the wall opposite the entrance, gripped the shotgun tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His eyes frantically scanned the shadows, seeking any movement. Suddenly, a scratching sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, then another and another. The sound came from above, from the roof. Michael raised his eyes, fear freezing his blood in his veins. The tiles began to move, displaced by an invisible force. Dust and pieces of rotten wood fell like a sinister rain. A low growl, almost a demonic purr, echoed through the space. Michael aimed the shotgun at the ceiling, his hands shaking uncontrollably. A black, sharp claw broke through the wood, followed by another. The roof was being opened like a can of sardines. With a deafening crash, an entire section of the roof collapsed. The dark, muscular form of the Chupacabra fell into the middle of the barn, its red eyes fixed on Michael. The creature rose slowly, its body covered in wounds that seemed not to affect it. Michael fired, the shot hitting the beast's flank. The Chupacabra howled in pain and rage, but instead of retreating, it advanced. Its claws cut through the air as it leaped from bale to bale, approaching with terrifying speed. Desperate, Michael looked for an escape. His eyes landed on a small side window. It was his only chance. He ran, feeling the creature's fetid breath on his neck. In one fluid motion, born of pure survival instinct, Michael threw himself against the window. The glass shattered, cutting his skin as he fell onto the hard ground outside. There was no time to feel pain. Michael got up, staggering. Behind him, the Chupacabra roared in frustration, its monstrous form writhing to fit through the narrow opening. The main house was only a few meters away. Michael ran like never before, knowing that every step could be his last. The sound of claws against the earth pursued him, growing ever closer. Reaching the porch, he turned around. The Chupacabra was only a few steps away, its jaws gaping to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. With a scream of desperation and defiance, Michael raised the shotgun one last time. The shot echoed in the night, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. The creature staggered, hit squarely in the chest. But was it enough? Michael didn't wait to find out. With the last of his strength, he threw himself into the house, slamming and locking the door behind him. Leaning against the solid wood, he slid to the floor, exhausted and wounded. Outside he could hear the creature's sounds, a mix of fury and pain. The night was far from over, and Michael knew that the true test of his survival had only just begun. The silence inside the house was deafening. Michael, leaning against the door, heard only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. Sweat dripped down his face, mingling with the blood from his wounds. Slowly he crawled away from the door, each movement sending waves of pain through his battered body. The darkness inside the house seemed to swallow him, the shadows dancing on the walls like mocking spectres. Michael reached for the light switch, but the light didn't come on. "Damn it," he murmured, remembering that the power often went out during storms, and this night was undoubtedly the worst storm he had ever faced. With trembling hands he lit a candle, its weak light barely illuminating the room. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, and every dark corner could hide the creature waiting to strike. The sound of claws scratching the exterior walls made Michael shrink back. It was as if the house was being enveloped by a deadly embrace. He could feel the presence of the creature outside, circling, looking for a way in. "I need to call for help," he thought, remembering the phone in the kitchen. But when he picked up the receiver, he was met with the dead silence of a cut line. The isolation of his situation hit him like a punch to the stomach. A dull thud upstairs made Michael jump. His eyes widened in terror. Impossible, he thought. There's no way it could have gotten in. But the sound of heavy footsteps echoing on the ceiling said otherwise. Michael gripped the shotgun, his sweaty hands slipping on the worn stock. He moved slowly towards the stairs, each step making the old floorboards creak underfoot. The corridor on the upper floor was shrouded in darkness. The flickering light of the candle created dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Michael advanced, his heart threatening to leap out of his chest at any moment. A low growl came from one of the rooms. Michael froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Slowly he turned towards the half-open door. Two red eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on him. Time seemed to stop. Michael could hear every beat of his heart, every drop of sweat running down his forehead. With a deafening roar, the creature leapt. Michael fired reflexively, the shot echoing through the house. Something heavy fell to the floor, and for a moment all was silent. Trembling, Michael approached. In the faint light of the candle, he saw the lifeless body of his old guard dog, Rex. The momentary relief was quickly replaced by a wave of horror and guilt. A sound from behind made Michael spin around. There, at the end of the corridor, was the real Chupacabra. Its red eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence, as if savoring the fear of its prey. Michael tried to shoot again, but the dry click of the gun indicated it was out of ammunition. Panic set in, as he realized he had fallen into the creature's perfect trap. The Chupacabra advanced slowly, savoring every moment of Michael's terror. Cornered, unarmed, and without hope, Michael closed his eyes, waiting for the final blow. But the attack never came. When he opened his eyes, the corridor was empty. The silence reigned once more oppressive than ever. Michael slid down the wall to the floor, exhausted and terrified. The night seemed endless, and he knew that the Chupacabra was just toying with him, like a cat with a mouse. As the hours dragged on, Michael fought against sleep and despair. Every sound, every shadow could be the harbinger of a new attack. And outside, in the darkness, the Chupacabra waited patiently, knowing its time would come. The battle for survival was far from over, and Michael knew that the horrors he had faced so far were only the beginning. The long night was not yet over, and dawn seemed an eternity away. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the cracks in the windows, finding Michael huddled in a corner of the room, the empty shotgun still clutched to his chest. His red, swollen eyes blinked, confused by the sudden light. For a brief moment he wondered if it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the pain in his body, the cuts and bruises were very real. The smell of blood and fear still hung in the air, a pungent reminder of the horrors of the night. With trembling legs, Michael stood up. The silence that now reigned was almost as oppressive as the night noises. Cautiously, he approached the window, fearing what he might see. The scene that unfolded before his eyes was one of pure devastation. What was once a prosperous farm now looked like an abandoned battlefield. Fences were down. The ground churned up as if a giant tractor had passed through. But the worst were the carcasses. Scattered across the land lay the mutilated bodies of his herd. Cows, sheep, horses, nothing had been spared. The morning sun shone mercilessly on the carnage, revealing details that the merciful darkness of the night had hidden. Michael opened the front door, the creak of the wood sounding deafening in the sepulchral silence. The fresh morning air carried the metallic smell of blood. He took a few hesitant steps outside, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the creature. But the Chupacabra had disappeared, leaving behind only destruction and unanswered questions. Walking slowly across the land, Michael began to assess the damage. Each step was a struggle against nausea and horror. Here and there he found strange footprints in the mud, tangible reminders that the previous night had not been a hallucination. When he reached the barn, the sight made him stagger. The roof was partially collapsed, the walls marked by deep scratches that no known animal could have made. The interior was a chaos of shattered wood and bloody hay. It was then that the reality of the situation hit him with full force. His farm, the work of a lifetime, was in ruins. His animals were dead, and he, a broken man, with a story no one would believe. Michael fell to his knees, tears finally breaking through the barrier of shock that had kept him functioning until then. Deep sobs shook his body as the adrenaline of the night gave way to overwhelming despair. Minutes or hours passed, he couldn't say. When he finally stood up, his eyes had a different gleam, determination mixed with something else, a spark of burgeoning obsession. Returning to the house, Michael picked up the phone. The line was still dead. He knew that eventually someone would come, a neighbor perhaps, or the milkman, but until then he had work to do. With still trembling hands, he began to gather everything that could serve as evidence. Photos of the footprints, samples of the black blood he had found, detailed notes of everything he had seen and heard during the night, because Michael knew with a certainty that frightened him that this would not be the last time the Chupacabra would attack, and next time he would be prepared. As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the devastated farm in a light almost cruel, in its normality, Michael prepared for a different kind of battle. A battle for the truth, for revenge, and for sanity. Dawn had revealed the horror of the previous night, but it had also planted the seed of an obsession that would forever change the course of Michael's life, and perhaps the fate of all those who would one day cross the path of the Chupacabra. The days that followed the attack dragged on like an endless nightmare for Michael. The world around him seemed to have lost its colors, reduced to shades of grey and red, the grey of constant fear and the vivid red of the blood. He couldn't forget. The authorities came and went, leaving behind sterile reports about wild animal attacks and empty promises of future investigations. No one believed his story about the Chupacabra. To them, it was just the delusion of a traumatized man. Michael found himself jumping at every sudden sound, his heart racing at the slightest noise in the night. The darkness, once a comforting shroud, after a long day's work, was now a realm of terror, where shadows came to life and red eyes lurked in every corner. Sitting on his porch, looking out over the fields that had once been his pride and joy, Michael felt the weight of the marks that night had left on his soul. "How can I go on?" he murmured to himself, his hands trembling as they held a cup of cold coffee. "How can I pretend the world is the same when I know what lurks in the shadows?" Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares. He relived the attack night after night, waking up drenched in cold sweat, the creature's scream echoing in his ears long after he opened his eyes. During the day, Michael busied himself with rebuilding the farm. The physical labor provided some relief, a temporary distraction from the dark thoughts that haunted him, but each repaired fence, each replaced animal, was a cruel reminder of what he had lost. The scars on his body, left by the Chupacabra's claws, itched and ached, a constant reminder that the creature was real, no matter what others said. Sometimes he found himself tracing the irregular lines with his fingers, as if he could extract the answers he sought from them. At night, sitting by the fireplace with a bottle of whiskey as his only company, Michael replayed the events of that night obsessively. Every detail, every sound and smell was etched in his memory with terrifying clarity. "I should have done more," he thought, guilt eating away at him from the inside. "I should have been stronger, faster, smarter." The loneliness weighed on him like a shroud. Friends and neighbors, unable to comprehend his obsession, began to avoid him. The whispers and pitying looks followed him whenever he went to town. "Poor Michael," they said. "He was never the same after that night." But how could he be? How could anyone face the impossible and remain unchanged? Michael knew he would never again be the man he was before. The innocence of a simple life had been ripped from him, leaving behind an empty shell filled only with fear and obsession. He began collecting books on folklore creatures, spending hours on the internet researching similar sightings. The walls of his office soon became covered with maps and newspaper clippings, connected by red strings in a pattern that only made sense to him. "It will come back," he murmured to himself as he worked on his theories. "And when it does, I'll be ready." The nights of the full moon were the worst. Michael spent those nights in vigil, the loaded shotgun by his side, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond his window. Part of him feared the creature's return. Another part, a part that frightened him even more, longed for it, because only then, face to face with the horror again, could he prove to the world and to himself that he wasn't crazy, that the monster was real, that the marks on his soul had a reason to be. And so the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Michael, once a simple and happy man, was now a tormented shadow of his former self. The marks left by the Chupacabra went far beyond the scars on his body. They were engraved in his mind, in his soul, forever altering the way he saw the world. The farm, once a place of life and prosperity, was now a silent monument to the horror of that night. And Michael, its solitary guardian, waited for the day the Chupacabra would return, for he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that that night had only been the beginning. Months had passed since that fateful night, and the story of the attack on Michael's farm had become a local legend. Whispered in bars, discussed at family gatherings, the narrative grew and distorted with each new version. The authorities had officially closed the case. The final report cited a wild animal attack, possibly a pack of wild dogs or wolves, explaining the devastation as the result of an unusual storm. The inexplicable marks, the strange footprints, Michael's tormented testimony, all were conveniently ignored or rationalized. But for those who cared to look closer, questions persisted. Questions that no one seemed able or willing to answer. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cryptozoologist from the State University, was one of the few who took Michael's story seriously. She spent weeks on the farm, collecting samples, analyzing the marks left by the creature. "There's something here that doesn't fit any conventional explanation," she confided to Michael during her last visit. "The claw marks, the composition of the blood found, everything indicates something beyond our current understanding." Her findings, however, were met with skepticism by the scientific community. Colleagues laughed at her theories, dismissing them as fantastical and unscientific. Elena found herself isolated, her reputation at risk. "Maybe it's better to leave some stones unturned," a colleague advised her. But she couldn't forget the haunted look in Michael's eyes, the conviction in his voice when he described the Chupacabra. Meanwhile, reports of similar sightings began to surface in other parts of the country, always at night, always in isolated rural areas. Stories of creatures that defied logic, of attacks that left more questions than answers. Michael followed each new report with a mix of fear and validation. Each story was an echo of his own experience, a silent confirmation that he was neither alone nor crazy. One particularly dark night, Michael received an unexpected visitor, a man in a suit who identified himself only as a government agent, appeared at his door. "Mr. Thompson," the man said, his voice a controlled murmur, "we would like to discuss your experience." The interrogation lasted hours, detailed questions about the creature's appearance, its behavior, the exact events of that night. Michael noticed that the man seemed more interested in confirming information than in questioning its veracity. At the end, the agent left a card with Michael. "If you remember anything else, or if it happens again, call this number, immediately." The card had no name, only a number and a strange symbol that Michael did not recognize. When he tried to call the next day, he found the number didn't exist. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Life on the farm slowly returned to an appearance of normalcy, but for Michael, nothing would ever truly be normal again. He continued his vigil night after night. The maps in his office expanded, covering entire walls. Patterns emerged, connections only he could see. Or were they just the delusions of an obsessed mind? In his darkest hours, Michael wondered if it had all been a hallucination, if stress and isolation hadn't created a monster in his mind. But then his fingers traced the scars on his body, and the doubt disappeared. The Chupacabra was real. It was out there, somewhere. And one day, Michael knew it would return. Meanwhile, in the depths of secret government facilities, in hidden university laboratories, and in the shadows of unexplored forests, others continued the search. Scientists, investigators, monster hunters, all pursuing the same enigma. The enigma of a creature that defied human understanding. A creature that blurred the lines between myth and reality, between nightmare and truth. The Chupacabra remained a mystery, a bloody question mark on the margins of human knowledge. To most it was just a legend, a story to scare children. But to Michael, and to the few who dared to look beyond the veil of everyday reality, the Chupacabra was much more. It was a reminder that the world is vaster, stranger, and more dangerous than most dare to imagine. And somewhere in the darkness, waiting patiently, the Chupacabra watched too, waiting for the right moment to emerge again from the shadows and remind humanity that there are things in this world that defy all explanation. The mystery persisted, a bloody enigma etched in the history of a farm and in the soul of a man, an enigma that might never be fully unraveled, Months had passed since that fateful night, but for Michael, time seemed to have stood still. The Santa Cruz farm, once a symbol of prosperity and tradition, was now a monument to horror. The physical scars had begun to heal, but the marks left on Michael's soul were deep and indelible. Michael had tried to rebuild his life, to restore the farm and return to his previous routine. However, every nocturnal sound, every moving shadow brought back memories of that infernal creature. Nights of peaceful sleep were a distant memory, replaced by endless vigils and nightmares that didn't end at dawn. News of the attack had spread quickly through the region, and soon the story became a local legend. Neighbors and friends avoided the subject, many doubting Michael's sanity, others fearing that the evil might return. The authorities had closed the case, categorizing it as a wild predator attack. But Michael knew the truth. The Chupacabra was real, and the danger it posed was far from eliminated. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the cryptozoologist who had visited the farm, continued her investigations in silence. Her studies and the evidence collected pointed to the existence of a creature beyond current scientific understanding. In secret meetings with other occult researchers, she discussed the implications of her discoveries and the need for preparation for future encounters with the inexplicable. Michael, for his part, had turned his office into a war room against the unknown. Maps, newspaper clippings, and photos covered the walls, connected by red strings tracing a pattern only he could understand. He knew that the Chupacabra would return, and this time he would be prepared. Full moon nights were the hardest. Michael spent those nights in vigil, the loaded shotgun by his side, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. He felt that the creature still watched him, waiting for the right moment to attack again. This constant vigilance was his new reality, a price he was willing to pay to protect what was left of his life and sanity. Despite all the preparation, Michael knew that his fight against the Chupacabra was more than a physical battle. It was a battle for his soul, for his ability to believe in the impossible and face the primal fear the creature represented. He was not just fighting a beast. He was fighting the very shadows of his past and the doubts that gnawed at his mind. As the sun rose over the devastated fields of Santa Cruz Farm, Michael prepared for another day of reconstruction and vigilance. He knew that the path ahead would be arduous and lonely, but he was determined not to let the horror of that night define him forever. The legacy of the Chupacabra had become ingrained in the land of the farm and in Michael's soul, and as long as he lived to tell his story, the shadow of the unknown continued to loom, a constant reminder that sometimes the true monsters are not those we see, but those we carry within ourselves. Michael's story is just one thread in the dark web that permeates our world. In every remote corner, behind peaceful fields and isolated farms, ancestral secrets challenge reality itself. The horror Michael faced may have been contained, but its echoes reverberate through the fabric of our universe, waiting to be heard by those willing to listen. The marks left by the Chupacabra on Santa Cruz Farm are not just physical. They are etched into Michael's soul and the memories of those who dare to believe his story. The fear of the unknown, the thin line between sanity and madness, all these compose the legacy left by that terrifying night. Stay tuned for the next tale from Draven Nocturnus, where new legendary creatures, dark pacts, and unimaginable horrors await those brave or foolish enough to unravel them. Remember, sometimes true terror is not hidden in the depths of the forest or in the shadows of the night, but within ourselves, in the secrets we carry and the truths we fear to face. Until the next night of nightmares, when the shadows lengthen again and the whispers from beyond find new ears to torment.